James Carlos stood beside his father's casket on a cold February morning in San Antonio, trying to memorize every weathered line on Mateo Carlos's face before they closed the lid forever. At 32 years old, James had weathered his share of hardship, but nothing had prepared him for this. His father, the man who'd crossed the border from Mycocan with nothing but calloused hands, was gone. Mateo had worked as a groundskeeper for 38 years, never making more than $42,000 annually, but he'd sacrificed everything to give James opportunities he'd never had. 2 weeks ago, a sudden heart attack had stolen him at 71 years old. But before I tell you what happened next, I need you to do something. If you've ever stood in a moment that should have meant everything, a moment where you needed the person you love most to just be there, and instead, they were doing the complete opposite? If that feeling just hit you somewhere deep, hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what James is about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty, love, and legacy. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this story, it's happening everywhere. In every city. In every marriage where one person is present, and the other is just performing. Now, back to James. As James stood there in the incense-heavy air of Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, surrounded by his father's compadres and families from the old neighborhood, he wasn't thinking about his grief. He was watching his wife check her Apple Watch for the 9th time in 15 minutes. Diana's wrist kept rotating. A quick glance. A swipe. Then her ice-blue eyes would scan toward the arched doorway like she couldn't wait to escape. Each time she did it, something cold and jagged carved deeper into James's chest. This wasn't grief making her restless. This was impatience. James felt his throat tighten as she pulled her iPhone from her Prada clutch and glanced at the screen, then quickly tucked it away when she noticed his tia Rosa watching her with narrowed eyes. "Mijo," his mother whispered beside him. Rosa Maria looked smaller than he'd ever seen her, her black mantilla trembling. Her weathered hand found his and squeezed. "Estás bien?" "I'm fine, Mama," James managed, the lie tasting like copper. He tried to ground himself in the warmth of her hand instead of the ice spreading through his veins as he watched Diana check her watch again. The funeral mass had drawn maybe 200 people. Co-workers from the maintenance company. Neighbors from the barrio. Families from the food bank where Mateo had volunteered for 20 years. Former students from the free ESL classes he'd taught every Sunday, never accepting a dime. These were his people. Working people. People who understood what Mateo Carlos had meant to this community. Diana looked like she'd been sentenced to community service. Father Dominguez spoke about Mateo's quiet generosity, how he'd rebuilt Mrs. Herrera's porch after the flood, organized fundraisers for struggling families, showed up every Saturday at dawn to maintain the church grounds with his battered toolbox and gentle smile. James tried to focus on the words, but Diana shifted beside him, crossing and uncrossing her legs beneath the designer dress that looked more cocktail party than Catholic funeral. She checked her watch again. 10:47 a.m. What the hell was happening at 10:47 that mattered more than this? Neither of them had any idea what was coming. Diana had no idea that in less than 6 hours, James was about to discover something that would detonate everything he thought he knew about his marriage and his father. After the mass, mourners filed past the casket. James stood with his mother and younger brother Miguel, accepting embraces and condolences, listening to story after story about his father's impact. Each one made him prouder and emptier in equal measure. Diana stood slightly apart, her smile tight and plastic. She checked her phone 4 more times, always turning away as if she thought he wouldn't notice. "Your wife seems muy incomoda," Miguel murmured. His brother was 28, a union electrician who'd inherited their father's gift for seeing through bullshit. "Everything good with you too?" "I don't know," James admitted quietly. "She's been acting weird all morning." Before Miguel could respond, Diana appeared at James's elbow, her expensive perfume cutting through the lingering frankincense. "The funeral director says we need to move to the cemetery," she said sharply, like she was running a meeting instead of accompanying her husband to bury his father. "The procession is starting in 5 minutes." Her tone was all business. Transactional. Cold. The drive to San Fernando Cemetery took 25 minutes. Diana sat in the passenger seat of their 9-year-old Camry, silent and rigid, her manicured nails tapping against her thigh. James drove mechanically, following the hearse, his mind spinning. He'd met Diana 4 years ago at a non-profit gala. She'd been there representing Hill and Morse Real Estate Development, working the room with a confidence that had pulled him in like gravity. She was polished in ways he wasn't. Ambitious in ways he'd never be. And for a while, he'd thought that balance was what made them work. Now, watching her stare out the window with that same distant expression she'd worn through his father's entire funeral, James wasn't sure what the hell they'd ever been. The burial at San Fernando Cemetery lasted 40 minutes under a grey sky that threatened rain but never delivered. James stood at the edge of the grave, watching his father's casket lower into the earth while Father Dominguez led the final prayers in Spanish. His mother wept quietly into a handkerchief his father had given her on their 30th anniversary. Miguel stood rigid, jaw clenched, fighting to keep himself together. Diana stood 3 feet away, scrolling through her phone. When it was over, people began making their way back to Our Lady of Guadalupe for the reception in the parish hall. His mother had spent the last 2 days cooking with his aunts, tamales, arroz con pollo, frijoles, fresh tortillas. It was how their community mourned. With food. With family. With stories that kept the dead alive just a little bit longer. James helped his mother into Miguel's truck, then walked to his Camry where Diana was already waiting in the passenger seat, windows up, AC blasting despite the mild February weather. He slid behind the wheel and started the engine without speaking. "Thank God that's over," Diana said, checking her face in the visor mirror. "I thought Father Dominguez would never stop talking. How long does a funeral service need to be? We were in that church for 2 hours." James's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "It's a Catholic funeral mass, Diana. That's how long they take." "Well, it's excessive." She snapped the visor closed. "And I don't know how you grew up in that church. The smell in there is overwhelming. Like old incense and mothballs mixed with, I don't know, poverty." The word hit James like a physical blow. "Poverty," he repeated slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm just saying it's very dated. The whole building feels like it hasn't been updated since the 70s. Diana pulled out a small bottle of hand sanitizer from her purse and rubbed it into her palms like she was washing away contamination. "Do we really have to go to this reception thing? How long is it expected to last?" James stared at her, genuinely unable to recognize the woman sitting beside him. This was the same person who'd stood at that altar 4 years ago and promised to love him through everything. The same person who'd smiled and laughed at their wedding reception when his tia Rosa had blessed them in Spanish and his cousins had played mariachi music until 2 in the morning. Now she couldn't stand to spend 2 hours honoring his father's memory. "Yes," James said, his voice cold and flat. "We really have to go. These are people who loved my father, who are here to support my family. And you're going to walk in there with me and show some goddamn respect." Diana's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "Excuse me." "You heard me." The parish hall was packed with people balancing paper plates loaded with food, filling the space with warm laughter and the smell of homemade cooking. James watched his mother move through the crowd, accepting hugs, her eyes still red but her face softening with each kind word about Mateo. This was what his father had built. Not wealth. Not status. Connection. Diana lasted 23 minutes. James was in the middle of talking to Mr. Ochoa, his father's supervisor from the maintenance company, when Diana appeared at his elbow with her phone pressed to her ear. "I understand," she was saying into the phone, her voice tight with manufactured urgency. "Yes, I can be there in 30 minutes. She lowered the phone and touched James's arm, her face arranged in an expression of regret that didn't reach her eyes. "Babe, I'm so sorry. That was Marcus from the office. We have an emergency with the Riverside Tower contract. The investors are threatening to pull out and I need to get to the office right now to handle the paperwork." James stared at her. "You're leaving? Right now?" "It's an emergency, James. I don't have a choice." She was already adjusting her purse on her shoulder, already stepping back. "Stay as long as you need to. I'll catch an Uber home." "Diana, we drove here together." "I know, but you should be here with your family anyway." She leaned in and gave him a quick, perfunctory kiss on the cheek that felt more like a business transaction than affection. "I'm really sorry. Tell your mom I said goodbye." And just like that, she was gone, her heels clicking across the linoleum floor, her silhouette disappearing through the double doors before James could even process what had just happened. "Mijo." James turned to find his tia Rosa standing beside him, her dark eyes sharp and knowing. She was his father's oldest sister, a woman who'd raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. She didn't miss much. "Your wife," Rosa said carefully, switching to Spanish. "She's been like this for a while now, hasn't she?" James wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in his throat. "I see the way she looks at you," Rosa continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Like you're not enough. Like this life, this family, we're all beneath her." She placed a weathered hand on his arm. "Your father saw it too. He didn't say anything because he didn't want to hurt you, but he saw it, mijo. And he worried." James felt something crack open inside his chest. "Tia." "I'm not telling you what to do," Rosa said. "I'm just telling you to open your eyes before you lose more than you already have today." James stayed at the reception until the last guest left, helping his mother and aunts pack up the leftover food, washing dishes in the church kitchen, doing anything to avoid going home. But by 7 o'clock, his mother was insisting he go rest, pressing a container of tamales into his hands and kissing his forehead like he was still a child. The drive home took 15 minutes through streets that had turned quiet under the streetlights. James and Diana lived in a modest duplex in Southtown, a neighborhood that was slowly gentrifying around them. Diana hated it. She wanted a modern condo downtown, something with floor-to-ceiling windows and a doorman. Something that said successful instead of struggling. James pulled into the driveway and noticed the living room lights were on, which was strange. Diana usually sat in the dark when she worked late, the glow of her laptop the only illumination she needed. He unlocked the front door and immediately knew something was wrong. The house had a hollow feeling to it, like air rushing into a vacuum. He moved through the living room toward their bedroom, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. The bedroom door was half open. Inside, their closet doors were flung wide. Diana's side was in chaos, hangers scattered on the floor, drawers pulled out, empty spaces where her clothes had been. On the bed sat 2 large designer suitcases, both open and half-packed with her belongings. James stood frozen in the doorway, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. That's when he heard her voice. She was in the bathroom, door cracked, phone pressed to her ear. And she was laughing. Not the polite, controlled laugh she used at work functions. A real laugh. Light and genuine and completely unburdened. I know, Diana was saying, her voice bright with an emotion James hadn't heard from her in months. Maybe years. "I almost lost it when that priest started the 3rd reading. I wanted to scream, 'We get it, he was a good man, can we please wrap this up?'" James's blood turned to ice. A male voice responded on the other end, muffled but audible. Diana laughed again. "No, he's still at the church playing the dutiful son," she said. "I have at least another hour. Maybe more if his mother keeps him there crying over more stories about what a saint his father was." Her tone dripped with mockery. "God, I'm so ready to be done with this. Finally free of the whole blue-collar guilt trip. No more pretending I'm okay living like we're 1 paycheck away from food stamps." James pushed the door open. Diana spun around, her face going pale. "I'll call you back," she said quickly, ending the call. "James," Diana said, her voice shifting instantly into damage control mode. "You're home early. I thought you'd be." "Who was that?" James's voice came out flat and cold, a tone he'd never used with her before. "It was just Marcus from work. We were discussing." "Don't." James held up his hand. "Don't insult me by lying right now. Not today." Diana's expression hardened. The mask of the concerned wife slipped away, revealing something underneath that James was only now allowing himself to see. Something calculating. Something cruel. "Fine," she said, setting her phone down on the bathroom counter. "You want the truth. I'm leaving, James. I've been planning this for weeks. I was going to wait until after the funeral to tell you, Try to be respectful, but honestly. She gestured at the suitcases. I can't do this anymore. I can't live in this tiny duplex, driving a decade-old car, watching you throw away opportunities because you want to give back to the community instead of making real money. James felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. This is about money. It's about having a life. Diana's voice rose. It's about not being embarrassed when my colleagues ask where I live or what my husband does. Do you know how it feels to tell people my husband makes $48,000 a year as a youth counselor, while I'm closing million-dollar real estate deals? I buried my father today, James said, his voice shaking now. And you're talking about being embarrassed. Your father lived in the same rundown house for 40 years, James. He mowed lawns for a living and died with nothing to show for it except a bunch of people at his funeral who are just as broke as he was. Diana's words came fast now, like poison she'd been holding back for years. I'm not doing that. I'm not going to be 70 years old, wearing the same dress I wore 20 years ago because I'm too cheap to buy a new one, pretending that struggling is somehow noble. The doorbell rang. Diana's eyes flicked to the bedroom door, and James saw something there. Anticipation. He walked past her to the front door and opened it. Standing on his porch was a man in an expensive charcoal suit, designer watch glinting under the porch light. Mid-40s, silver at the temples, the kind of polished confidence that came from never having to check a price tag. James recognized him from the company website Diana had shown him months ago. Marcus Hill, senior partner at Hill and Morse Real Estate Development, and Diana's boss. You must be James, Marcus said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He extended his hand like they were meeting at a networking event. I'm here to help Diana with her things. This must be difficult, and I wanted to make sure. Get off my porch, James said quietly. Marcus's smile faltered. Look, I understand you're upset, but let's be adults about. Adults. James laughed, the sound bitter and raw. You're sleeping with my wife on the day I buried my father, and you want to talk about being adults. Your wife is leaving because she wants more than this, Marcus gestured dismissively at the duplex. And frankly, I don't blame her. Diana deserves someone who can provide the lifestyle she's earned. Diana appeared behind James in the doorway, her suitcases in hand. Marcus, just put these in the car. I'll be right there. James stepped aside, watching as the man who'd just destroyed his marriage walked his wife's designer luggage to a silver Porsche Cayenne parked at the curb. The vehicle probably cost more than James made in 2 years. I'll have my lawyer send over the divorce papers, Diana said, not quite meeting his eyes. You can keep the duplex. I don't want it anyway. And honestly, James, you'll be better off. Find someone who's content with this. She waved her hand vaguely at the house, at him, at his entire life, this small existence. Because I'm not. Get out, James said. I'm going. No, I mean get out right now. Take whatever you can carry and leave. The rest of your shit will be on the lawn tomorrow morning. Diana's eyes flashed. You can't just. It's my name on the lease, Diana. Mine. So yeah, I can. James's voice was deadly calm now, the anger crystallizing into something cold and hard. You've got 60 seconds before I call the police and report a trespasser. She stared at him for a long moment, then grabbed her purse and walked out without another word. James watched through the window as Marcus opened the Porsche's passenger door for her, as they drove away into the night, as the red taillights disappeared around the corner. Then he was alone. The silence in the duplex was suffocating. James looked around at the space he'd thought was a home and saw it through Diana's eyes. The second-hand couch, the scratched coffee table, the walls that needed painting. Small. Insufficient. Embarrassing. He couldn't stay here. James grabbed his keys and drove across town to his father's house, the small 2-bedroom in the west side barrio where he'd grown up. His mother had gone to stay with his tia Rosa for the night, needing the company of family. The house was dark and empty when James let himself in with the key he'd carried since childhood. Inside, everything was exactly as his father had left it. The worn recliner facing the modest TV. The kitchen table with 2 chairs. Framed photos on the walls, James's high school graduation, Miguel's wedding, family gatherings spanning 4 decades. The air still smelled faintly of his father's Old Spice aftershave and the Café Bustelo he'd drink every morning. James sank onto the old couch, the same one he'd sat on as a kid watching Saturday morning cartoons, and finally let himself break. He'd lost everything in one day. His father, the man who'd sacrificed everything to give him a better life. His wife, who'd looked at that sacrifice and seen only poverty and shame. His marriage, his home, his belief that love could bridge any divide. James pulled out his phone and looked at the last photo he had of his father, taken just 3 weeks ago at Sunday dinner, Mateo smiling over a plate of his wife's enchiladas, completely unaware that pancreatic cancer was already killing him. "I'm sorry, Papa," James whispered into the empty house. "I'm sorry I wasn't enough." He fell asleep on that couch fully clothed, his father's jacket draped over him like a blanket, feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in his entire life, wondering how he was supposed to keep going when everything that mattered had been ripped away. James woke to sunlight streaming through the thin curtains, disoriented until reality crashed back into him. His father was dead. His wife was gone. He was alone in the house where he'd grown up, and nothing would ever be the same. His phone showed 9:47 a.m. and 3 missed calls from his mother. He texted her that he was okay, just needed some time alone, then forced himself off the couch. The house felt like a museum of his father's life. Every object told a story: the coffee mug with a faded "World's Best Dad" that James had given him in 3rd grade, the reading glasses on the side table next to a Spanish language Bible, the work boots by the door that Mateo had worn until the soles separated from the leather. James knew he should eat something, should shower, should do any of the normal things living people did. Instead, he found himself standing in front of his father's bedroom closet. His mother would need help sorting through Mateo's belongings eventually. Maybe starting now would be easier than thinking about his own shattered life. James opened the closet door. Inside hung perhaps a dozen shirts, all worn soft from years of washing. 3 pairs of work pants. 1 suit, the one Mateo had been buried in, had been newer, purchased specifically for the funeral. On the floor sat 2 pairs of work boots and 1 pair of church shoes. This was what 40 years of work had produced, according to Diana's logic. A closet that could be emptied in a single afternoon. James began taking the shirts off their hangers, folding them carefully, when he noticed something odd. The closet felt shorter than it should be. He'd played hide-and-seek in this closet as a kid, and he remembered it being deeper. He pushed aside the remaining clothes and knocked on the back wall. Hollow. His heart began to beat faster. James ran his hands along the panel until he found a small gap. He pulled, and the false wall came away, revealing a space about 2 feet deep. Inside, pushed into the corner and covered with an old work jacket, sat a metal box. James pulled it out, grunting at the unexpected weight. The box was about the size of a large toolbox, made of heavy steel, scratched and dented like it had survived decades. A sturdy combination lock secured the latch. He set it on his father's bed and stared at it. In 32 years, he'd never seen this box. Never knew this hidden space existed. What had his father been hiding? James searched the nightstand drawer, the dresser, anywhere his father might have written down a combination. Nothing. He tried his father's birthday. His mother's birthday. His own. The lock didn't budge. Then he remembered, his parents' anniversary. September 15th. The 15th of September, 82. He dialed 0-9-1-5. The lock clicked open. James lifted the lid, expecting maybe some old photographs or immigration documents. Family heirlooms from Mexico. Sentimental items his father had wanted to preserve. Instead, he found himself staring at neat stacks of documents in plastic sleeves. Legal papers. And on top, a worn leather portfolio embossed with gold lettering, property deeds and land titles. James's hands trembled as he opened the leather portfolio. Inside were property deeds, each one protected in clear plastic, organized with the meticulous care his father had applied to everything in his life. The first deed was dated March 1986. A half-acre lot on South Alamo Street purchased for $18,000. James knew that street. It was downtown now, surrounded by trendy restaurants and boutique hotels. The second deed, June 1989. A corner lot on McCullough Avenue. Purchase price, $22,000. The third, September 1992. A full acre near the Pearl Brewery District. $31,000. James's mind was racing. These weren't random purchases. His father had bought neglected lots in areas that were considered worthless 40 years ago. Spaces that developers had ignored, that the city had forgotten. Spaces that were now prime commercial real estate in one of the fastest-growing cities in America. Beneath the deeds were bank statements, investment documents, and lease agreements. His father had been renting these lots as parking spaces for decades, quietly collecting income that he'd apparently never touched. At the bottom of the box sat a sealed envelope with Para Mihijo James written in his father's careful handwriting. James's vision blurred. He opened the envelope with shaking hands. Miho, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I never told you about this while I was alive. I wanted you to make your own way, to find your own strength, not to rely on money you didn't earn. I bought these lots with money I saved by living simply. Your mother knew, but we agreed, this wasn't for us. This was for you and Miguel, for your futures, for your children. Don't feel guilty about this money. I earned it with my hands and my mind. I saw opportunities where others saw wasteland. That's not luck, Miho. That's wisdom. Use it well. Use it to help others the way you always have. And don't let anyone tell you that being humble means being poor, or that working with your hands means you're worth less than men in suits. I love you. I'm proud of you. Now go build something beautiful. Papa. James sat there on his father's bed, tears streaming down his face, holding a letter from a dead man who'd just changed his entire life. The next morning, James sat across from Gerald Hoffman, the estate attorney whose business card had been clipped to the portfolio. Hoffman was in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. I handled these transactions for your father for almost 30 years, Hoffman said, spreading the documents across his desk. Mateo was one of the shrewdest investors I've ever known. He understood something most people don't, that patient money grows into powerful money. How much? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hoffman pulled out a detailed valuation report. The 3 lots alone, given current market values and development potential, are worth approximately $2.8 million. The parking lease income over 40 years, invested conservatively as your father instructed, has grown to another $740,000. He looked up at James. Combined total, your father's estate is valued at $3.54 million, before taxes. James couldn't breathe. There's something else, Hoffman continued. Your father updated his will 6 months ago. Everything is divided equally between you and your brother, with a specific trust established for your mother's care. But there's a codicil, a special provision. He slid a document across the desk. Any assets discovered within 90 days of your father's death, that were unknown to your spouse at the time of marriage or separation, are considered separate property under Texas law. Meaning Diana gets nothing, James finished, his voice hollow with shock. Correct. Your father was very specific about protecting this legacy. James started laughing. He couldn't help it. The sound came out broken and raw, somewhere between grief and vindication, between rage and relief. His father, the humble groundskeeper, the man Diana had mocked as a poverty-stricken gardener, had died a multimillionaire. And she'd walked away from it all for a man with a Porsche. James hired the attorney that very afternoon. Not the cheapest option, but someone Hoffman had recommended, a sharp woman named Patricia Vega who specialized in complex divorces and asset protection. I want this done fast, James told her in their first meeting. And I want it done clean. Patricia reviewed the timeline. Diana had left 2 days after Mateo's death. The estate hadn't been probated yet. The assets were undiscovered at the time of separation. She smiled like a poker player holding a royal flush. Your father was a smart man. Texas is a community property state, but separate property acquired by inheritance is protected. And since your wife left before you discovered these assets, she has no claim to them whatsoever. Patricia leaned back in her chair. But here's the beautiful part. She doesn't know that. She thinks you're the broke youth counselor she abandoned. So what do? We give her exactly what she wants. A quick, clean divorce. We offer her the duplex, which she's already said she doesn't want. We split the joint checking account, which has what, maybe $3,000? We let her walk away thinking she dodged a bullet, that she escaped a life of poverty. Patricia pulled out a standard divorce agreement. She'll sign this within a week if she thinks it means she can move on with her new life. And the moment she signs, she waives any claim to assets discovered after separation. It's ironclad. James thought about Diana's face when she'd mocked his father's legacy, when she'd called his life small, when she'd laughed about finally being free. Do it, he said. The divorce papers were delivered to Diana's office 3 days later. Patricia had kept them simple, almost insultingly so. James would keep the duplex and his personal vehicle. Diana would keep her car and her personal belongings. Joint accounts would be split 50/50ths. No alimony requested by either party. A clean break. Patricia called James the next afternoon, and he could hear the satisfaction in her voice. She signed this morning. Didn't even have a lawyer review it. She just wanted it done. That fast. Her assistant told my paralegal that Ms. Hill is eager to move forward with her life and saw no point in dragging out an amicable separation. Patricia's tone was dry. She actually waived the standard 60-day waiting period and paid the expedite fee herself. The divorce will be final in 2 weeks. James sat in his father's house, his house now, holding the phone and feeling something he hadn't felt since before his father died. Power. Not the kind that came from money, though he had that now. The kind that came from knowing the truth while others lived in their delusions. Diana had thrown away $1.77 million, half of what would have been community property if she'd stayed just a few more weeks. She'd traded a fortune for an affair with her boss, bet everything on a man who wore expensive suits and drove a Porsche. And she had no idea what she'd lost. There's one more thing, Patricia said. She left a message asking if you'd be willing to let her come by the duplex next week to pick up some items she forgot. Some designer shoes, apparently, and a jewelry box. James thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Tell her she can come by Saturday at noon, he said. I'll leave everything boxed up on the porch. He wasn't cruel enough to tell her face to face. But he wasn't generous enough to let her keep pretending she'd made the right choice, either. The universe had a way of teaching lessons. James was just going to let it work. 6 months later, James stood in front of a crowd of 200 people, cutting the ribbon on the Mateo Carlos Community Center. The building had once been an abandoned warehouse on South Alamo Street, one of the properties his father had owned. James had invested $800,000 renovating it into a state-of-the-art facility with a computer lab, tutoring rooms, a commercial kitchen for cooking classes, and a gymnasium. The local news was there. So was the mayor. The San Antonio Express-News had run a feature story the week before. Son honors immigrant father's secret legacy with $3.5 million community investment. James had made sure the story mentioned everything. How Mateo Carlos had come from Mexico with nothing. How he'd worked as a groundskeeper for nearly 4 decades. How he'd quietly built a real estate fortune through patience and vision. How his son was now using that fortune to create opportunities for immigrant families just like his own. The article had gone viral locally, shared thousands of times, picked up by state and national news outlets as a feel-good story about the American dream. James's phone had been ringing for weeks with interview requests. He'd ignored most of them. But he'd made sure to do the ones he knew Diana would see. His mother stood beside him at the ribbon cutting, tears streaming down her face. Miguel was there with his wife and kids. Tia Rosa. Father Dominguez. Mr. Ochoa from his father's old job. The community that had shown up for Mateo's funeral had shown up for his legacy. James thought about his father as he cut the ribbon, about the letter he'd read 100 times, about the quiet strength it took to live humbly while building something extraordinary. He didn't think about Diana at all. But she was thinking about him. Across town, Diana Hill sat in her cramped studio apartment, all she could afford after Marcus had ended things 3 months ago, staring at her laptop screen in absolute horror. The Express News article was open in front of her, alongside photos of James smiling at a groundbreaking ceremony, James shaking hands with the mayor, James standing in front of a building with his father's name in bronze letters above the door. $3.5 million estate, the article said. Mateo Carlos, who worked as a groundskeeper, had quietly accumulated prime commercial real estate. Diana's hands were shaking. She scrolled to another article, this one from Texas Monthly, with the headline, "The Groundskeeper's Fortune, How One Immigrant Built Millions While Living on $42,000 a Year." There was a photo of James holding up one of the original property deeds, dated 1986. All of it purchased before their marriage. All of it inherited after their separation. All of it legally, completely, irrevocably beyond her reach. Diana had signed away her rights 2 weeks before the estate was probated. She'd been so eager to start her new life with Marcus that she hadn't even had a lawyer review the settlement. She'd waived claims to any future assets, thinking there were no future assets to claim. Marcus had left her 8 weeks later for a 26-year-old heiress he'd met at a charity auction. He'd sent Diana a text message to end things. Hadn't even had the decency to do it in person. She'd lost her marriage, her home, and her dignity for a man who discarded her the moment someone with a bigger trust fund came along. And now she was watching her ex-husband, the one she'd mocked for his small existence, give away more money to charity than she'd earn in a lifetime. Diana's phone rang. Her mother, probably calling after seeing the news. She didn't answer. Instead, she closed the laptop, walked to her window, and looked out at the parking lot of her apartment complex, crying for everything she'd thrown away. The Mateo Carlos Community Center had been open for 3 weeks when James finally allowed himself to believe it was real. He walked through the building most mornings before the staff arrived, listening to the echo of his footsteps in the hallways, running his hand along walls that bore his father's name. Today was different. Today was the official grand opening celebration, the one they'd planned for the community with food trucks and live music and free registrations for all the center's programs. James stood on the small stage they'd erected in the parking lot, looking out at hundreds of faces, families from the West Side, kids who'd benefit from the after-school tutoring, elderly immigrants who'd signed up for the ESL and citizenship classes, local business owners who'd donated supplies and funding. His mother sat in the front row, wearing her best dress, the same one she'd worn to Mateo's funeral, but somehow it looked different now. Lighter. She was smiling through tears as Father Dominguez blessed the building in Spanish and English. "My father used to tell me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he keeps, but by what he gives," James said into the microphone, his voice steady and clear. Mateo Carlos lived that truth every single day. He gave his time, his knowledge, his labor, his love. And without anyone knowing, he built something that would outlive him. James gestured to the building behind him, 3 stories of glass and brick with Mateo Carlos Community Center, in bold letters above the entrance. This is his real legacy. Not the money. Not the property. This. A place where people can learn, grow, build futures for themselves and their families. A place that says your worth isn't determined by where you came from or how much you make, but by the content of your character and the strength of your effort. The crowd erupted in applause. Miguel stood and whistled. Tia Rosa was crying openly now, clutching a photo of Mateo to her chest. James caught a movement at the edge of the crowd as he stepped off the stage. Someone standing apart from the celebration, half hidden behind a food truck. Diana. She was thinner than he remembered, her designer clothes replaced by something off the rack. Her hair was pulled back simply, no expensive styling. She wasn't wearing the watch she used to check obsessively. Their eyes met across the parking lot. James saw everything in that moment, the regret, the devastation, the full weight of understanding what she'd lost. Not just the money. The man. The family. The community. The legacy she could have been part of. She opened her mouth like she might call out to him, might try to approach, might attempt some kind of reconciliation or explanation. James held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned his back. He walked toward his mother, toward Miguel and his family, toward Father Dominguez and Tia Rosa and Mr. Ochoa and all the people who'd actually shown up when it mattered. The people who'd measured worth in loyalty and love instead of bank accounts and status symbols. Behind him, he heard nothing. No footsteps approaching. No voice calling his name. When he glanced back a minute later, she was gone. James spent the rest of the day exactly where he belonged, surrounded by his community, honoring his father's memory, building something that would matter long after he was gone. That evening, as the sun set over San Antonio and the last families were leaving the center, James stood alone in the main hall. His father's portrait hung on the wall, Mateo in his work clothes, that gentle smile, those strong hands that had built an empire one careful choice at a time. "We did it, Papa," James whispered. "Your name means something. Not because of the money. Because of this." His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I'm sorry. For everything. You deserved better. He deserved better. D." James read it once, then deleted it without responding. Some apologies came too late. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. He turned off the lights, locked the doors, and drove home to his father's house, the small, humble house he decided to keep exactly as it was. Because it turned out that the size of a man's house had nothing to do with the size of his life. Mateo Carlos had proven that. And James was going to spend the rest of his life making sure the world knew it. So let me ask you something. How many people in your life have judged you by what you drive, where you live, or what's in your bank account instead of what's in your heart? How many times have you been made to feel small by someone who measured success in dollars instead of impact? James's father spent 40 years being invisible to people like Diana. Dismissed. Overlooked. Mocked for his work boots and his brown bag lunches. But Mateo Carlos understood something that most people never learn. True wealth isn't about what you display, it's about what you build in silence and reveal in time. If this story hit you the way it hit me, do me a favor right now. Smash that like button if you believe karma is real and that people like Diana always get exactly what they deserve. Subscribe and turn on notifications because I've got more stories about people who underestimated the wrong person and lived to regret it. And drop a comment telling me, have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked or what you did for a living? How did you prove them wrong? I read every single comment, and I want to hear your story. Also, and this is important, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's been made to feel like they're not enough. Someone who's grinding in silence while others are flashing what they don't really have. Send this to them right now. Because the world needs more Mateo Carlos stories. And fewer Dianas. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, remember, the people who mock your humble beginning rarely stick around for your powerful ending. Peace.